What's your concept of a large amount of money? A sum you really just can't wrap your head around. For most of us, the larger the sum, the less we're able to fully grasp that full amount. So if I said to you, here's 14 billion rand, could you even imagine what that would do? It's an eye-watering amount of money, and it's been lost to material irregularities by national and provincial entities. And the Auditor General says it's irrecoverable. It's gone into a black pit, never coming back. She says many departments, institutions, and municipalities are still battling with financial governance. And she's joining us now to explain. Tsakani Maluleke is, of course, the Auditor General of South Africa. Thank you, as always, for talking to us. You are, in a sense, colloquially speaking, South Africa's chief accountant, if I may say, and our numbers simply don't add up.
Good morning, Bongani, and morning to your listeners. Well, the point we're making is that it is absolutely crucial that we get the numbers to add up regularly, because if you're trying to catch up on numbers that you failed to account for over multiple years, the likelihood of them adding up a number of years later is very low, let alone finding that money. That was the point we're making.
No, and it's a point well made. We've spoken to you a number of times. You've been at the helm since 2020, and from what you've been telling us, in many of these institutions, it's still a horror show. What's going on?
Well, for far too many institutions, the ability to look after the basics is still quite weak. Admittedly, there are a number that have improved over time, and we must make that point, especially in the provincial and national governments. We're seeing major improvement in terms of how they look after the monies in their hands, although there's still some way to go. In the local government sphere, the picture is not as encouraging. There are far too many municipalities that don't have the institutional capability to do what they're supposed to do. So by that, I'll give you an example. In Machabeng, back in 2019, we identified that they had overpaid a contractor for some work done on a stormwater drainage system. They overpaid by just over 7 million rand. We picked this up, raised it as a material irregularity, which means that unlike before, they couldn't ignore us this time. So we had to keep following up on whether or not they were getting the money back. We then realized after a year or so of following up that they were still not getting this money back. We referred the matter to the Hawks, and we have now taken remedial action to compel them to get the money back. Now, you're now in 2023, where we saw the arrest of a few people by the Hawks, which is very encouraging. As we sit in 2024, the money has not yet come back. You can imagine it's unlikely that we will get the full 7 million rand back into the coffers of the state. It's not for lack of trying on our part. It's not for lack of attention by the Hawks, but it is due to the failure of the people who are tasked with managing that purse. Fortunately, since then, there have been some improvements in Machabeng, but it is about those basics. Don't overpay for things that you're receiving. Certainly don't pay for things you don't receive. And make sure that you manage your money, public money, effectively on basis.
But in a way, some of these incidents are by design, not even by accident. In other words, we want some cream at the top, and that we can split amongst ourselves. And so entities tend to overbill municipalities precisely because they're in cahoots with officials from within.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why we keep saying that we've got to make sure that the officials within those municipalities know exactly what to do to detect these problems, because if an official in there is doing something wrong, there should be enough checks and balances that are maintained by the head of that administration to detect these problems quickly. And if they don't, then what happens is people continue to do this in cahoots, as you say, with external service providers, benefit themselves and fleece the public purse. We then also have been calling for citizens to act differently. The contractor that is now acting in cahoots and robbing the public purse effectively is stealing from the poor. And then they want to be part of those who then decry the lack of public services. I mean, if you look at the fee states, I'll give you yet another example. There was a particular contractor who was hired to go and collect electricity monies, so monies due to the state. for electricity services. And this was an outsourced service which should never have been. They were paid over 100 million rand, or they collected over 100 million rand, and then they failed to pay it into the coffers of the state. When we pick this up, we then raise it, and the board of that entity fails to do anything about it. We then finally reported the matter to the Hawks. We are now trying to get the state attorney to get the money back. But guess what? That company is being liquidated. So the likelihood of getting that money back is very low. And so all of us have to act differently.
What about personal liability for failures or dereliction of duty or even corruption? Because my sense at times is that some of these entities seem to think of money as though it was monopoly money.
You know, you're quite right. We have to get to a point where personal liability does prevail. Now, much of it lies in the hands of the law enforcement agencies as well as us as the AG. So when we refer matters to the investigations bodies and to law enforcement, it's important that there be criminal consequences that follow, as well as recovery of money that's gone missing. But personal liability in terms of the people who are running the state becomes difficult. One of the key features, and follow that example I was sharing with you now on the Free State, the board of that particular entity has changed a number of times since this transgression was picked up, which then makes it difficult for us to pursue individuals because they then leave the state and move on to other things. It tells us that we've got to worry about making sure we do hire decent people to run these entities, decent in that they are capable, that they are ethical, and that when something goes wrong, they take ownership and they deal with it swiftly. We've also got to make sure that the people that supervise them, so the NEC responsible for this entity, should have acted much more quickly, and they didn't. So by the time the AG comes to step in, and we do our very best, as much I can tell you, by the time we step in, time has moved on, and so the likelihood of getting money back is quite low. But that's not to say that we're not getting any successes. The point you've been making is that we have been able to get some successes, and that tells us that there is an ability to act swiftly to get money back. Out of the 14 billion we said was lost in PFMA, from what we could find, 2.5 billion rand has come back or is in the process of being recovered. That's encouraging. What we've got to do is close the gap between the 2.5 billion and the 14 billion.
But of course, a lot of the problems are, as you say, at local government level. And one of the questions I was asking is it time that we professionalize the running of municipalities? How is it, for example, possible in some instances to have municipal managers who can't read financial statements? That is still a phenomenon that is present.
And that's exactly why I agree with you. It is urgent that we professional local government alongside the rest of the state. And it's critical that we worry about the competence of municipal managers, CFOs, etc., just as much as we worry about the competence of councillors. The political leadership in municipalities has significant responsibilities put on it by how the law is structured. If we don't worry about the type of people that are executing on those duties, we're going to continue to misfire in terms of how local government runs.
I mean, there's something, and I don't know if you can comment on this, and I'll understand if you can't or if you won't, but take an entity like the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, for example. It has for years engaged in expensive litigation with repeated losses to try and get rid of executives, and no one stops that ping-pong ball. As we speak, there are two individuals who believe they were rightly appointed as CEOs of that entity, and both of them could argue didn't appoint themselves. And nobody seems to be watching this and saying, hang on, what is going on here?
Yeah, I agree that it's crucial that the board act differently, because you're quite right, those individuals didn't appoint themselves, but also the executive authority that supervises that board, we should be looking to them to act differently. Unfortunately, you've had far too much instability at both those levels, and it makes it difficult for governance to prevail. And so it is a tragedy that you've got this wastage of funds. It is a tragedy that you then have instability in how that institution runs. And we know that there's a great deal of work to be done before we can get PRASA operating at the right level for the benefit of people that need its services.
Is Section 195 of the Constitution a pipe dream? I mean, it calls for efficiency and effectiveness in delivering mandates in transparent and accountable ways. Is that a pipe dream?
I don't believe so. I think it's something we must continue to aspire for. We must aspire for transparency and accountability just as much as Section 195 says, as well as efficiency and effectiveness and operating on mandate. That's crucial. We have to continue to strive for that.
The president recently made some noises about paying closer attention to local government. Does that encourage you?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's most encouraging, given the state of local government, given the issues we've been flagging for a long time on local government, and especially given the impact of these weaknesses in local government. It is encouraging to see the national sphere of government taking greater ownership of this space. We've also seen some success when provincial government steps in. You might recall that over the last couple of years, we've lamented that far too many municipalities either don't bother to submit financial statements or they end up with repeat disclaimers of audit opinions, which is the worst outcome you can get, especially when you're dealing with public money. We've seen provincial governments across the country taking greater ownership of this and supporting municipalities to get out of that space, which then tells us that if we all act together across the different spheres and we coordinate our efforts, there is greater hope for change.
Not all heroes wear capes. Tsakani Maluleke, I think you're an example of that. Thank you for your time.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions.
Your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.